Thank you. Can people usually hear me okay? Okay, so I have a few, what you would call it, things? Yes, access copies, thank you. And, do you want to, yeah. They're of the PowerPoint. It's funny to call them access copies because the font on them is like super tiny. And also I changed the order of some of the slides. But if it helps people follow, I'm also happy to email it to people, and so on. So this is from a book. What I'm giving you today would be really the rationale of a book that I'm finishing now. It's going to come out in April. It's called Incarcerating Disability, The Institutionalization and Prison Abolition, University of Minnesota Press. And what I'm going to do today is a very kind of broad overview. And then in the Q&A, we can get more into the nitty-gritty, whatever people have interest in hearing more about. So I also want to thank Danielle for moderating and for Nirmala for being, existing, and really, yeah, and kind of nourishing a lot of what we do in disability studies. And of course, I want to thank Chloe and everybody for inviting me here. So I think we're all here. We know maybe what abolition is. A lot of us do work around prisons. But I'm not sure that we all have the same kind of proficiency in regards to disability and abolition and disability and kind of carceral spaces. And for me, discussing mass incarceration, which is really the reason why I wrote this book, is because discussing mass incarceration and decarceration without referring to disability ignores the varied locales in which incarceration happens. So I write a lot about incarceration in psychiatric hospitals and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. I don't write very much about nursing homes, but other people do. Nirmala writes about classrooms and schools. So there's a lot of places where incarceration happens. And I don't mean metaphorically, I mean like really. Incarceration, people who talk about their lives as incarcerated or imprisoned. Talking about incarceration and decarceration without referring to disability also avoids an understanding of disability as an analytical category, as a way to view the world as a lived experience, and a way to inform policy and activist resolutions to vast social problems such as incarceration. So to me, disability is not just an analytic, it's not just a lived experience, it's always both of those things at the same time. And this talk, I see it as, this comes from deaf studies. They talk a lot about, instead of hearing loss, that we should talk about deaf gain. So I think that's a really kind of important formulation. So for me, this is disability gain. Like, what do we gain when we include disability? Part of my disabilities and analytical framework comes from Quip of Color critique. And this is based on Kathy Cohen, Dean Spade, and other people's work that really urge us to frame issues of criminalization and incarceration through what Rod Ferguson described as a queer of color critique in Operations in Black. And queer of color critique questions traditional white liberal approaches to social problems, such as calls requiring more legislation and incorporation within the system. I think Alexa talked about that a lot yesterday in relation to the LGBTQ community. But instead, we should understand these issues through an intersectional lens that has a broader analysis of what we come to call freedom and what liberation might be. So following such frameworks, I want to ask, what is disability justice, or a quip of color critique of incarceration and decarceration would be? So for those who don't know, and sometimes I do like hour-long talks about this. This is one slide. Prison is very maddening and very disabling. There's various examples to this. For example, the toxic conditions and materials within carceral spaces, especially prisons, For example, I don't know if people are aware, but recent California fires were extinguished a lot by prisoner labor, both men and women who worked as firefighters, basically. And you can think about the kind of lasting effects that would have on their bodies. Closed wards with poor air quality, lack of medical equipment, no affirming health care, which, by the way, also doesn't exist outside of prisons in the US. No sanctioned access to sexuality or reproductive health care, forced sterilization, also something that happens in women's facilities. Strip searches, which of course are very traumatizing, and as abolitionist feminists say, prisons are state-sanctioned violence against women. So they're not a solution to violence against women, they are violence against women. The other thing is prison is very maddening if we think of administrative segregation, for example, supermax facilities, but also in general, just the conditions of living confined. So both disability studies and those critiquing imprisonment or carcerality share a critique of rehabilitation. They share a critique of disciplining bodies, of normalization, and the colonial roots of these kind of practices. So what I'm trying to bring here is a crip of color analysis of incarceration that's combined with feminist, decolonial analysis of abolition. And the work of Luana Ross, for example, in kind of talking about how the impulse to rehabilitate, which felt most potently at the mid-20th century in the criminal justice system, is entrenched in colonial impetuses. In North America, both Canada and the US, this trend continued through the attempt to assimilate indigenous communities in particular in order to civilize them through training schools and then continuing on in prisons as well. In disability studies and disability rights movements, there are also very vast critiques of notions of cure and rehabilitation of disabled people. Of course, some disabled people are indigenous, trauma, what has now come to be called the residential school syndrome. Diane Millian, Lina Palacios have really good analysis of that, so I'm not gonna go into that. But within disability literature, rehabilitation is seen as a way to normalize people to fit particular societal norms regarding bodily function, behavior, and appearance, which are not necessarily shared by those who medical professions try to rehabilitate. And by body, I also mean mind, and I'm very much taking this from the med movement, neurodiversity movement as well. What they also share, they, meaning disability studies and those critiquing imprisonment, particularly from a feminist abolition stance, the colonial stance, is also a critique of corrections, which is the desire to fix or correct people through medical, surgical, chemical treatments, through segregation, through incarceration, and so on. So they share this thing in common as well. And also the critique of individualizing social issues, and instead they demand a focus on intersectional systemic analysis. So this is what crip of color analysis brings. In addition, imprisonment and institutionalization, this comes from Angela Davis, says that this is a core structure that shapes social relations in society, not just for those affected directly, but for everyone. So for those who think, oh, I don't know people in prison or in an institution, therefore it doesn't affect me, well, feminist abolition really looks at that as a core institution within society. And a crip of a color analysis does the same thing. I called it, in my own work, the institution yet to come. So the lives of a lot of people with disabilities is just kind of either the threat of institutionalization, or when you grow old, you'll be in an institution, or you have been in an institution. It's never more than one step away from the lives of most people with disabilities. In addition, what feminist abolition or crip of color analysis of incarceration brings is reconceptualizing notions like crime or innocence, what and who gets to be defined as crime or as criminals, but also redefining what disability is, So looking at disability as an identity, not just a medical diagnosis, and looking at it as a form of something that has a culture and a history, including a history of oppression and resistance. In relation to this history of oppression and resistance, and that's, something very, I think that many people don't recognize, but I mean, even as a person with a disability, I did not know I have a culture and a history, right? And I think that that experience is, the majority of people with disabilities have that experience, that we are completely taken away from that. So in relation to that history, critiques of the abolition of incarceration say that these are the, kind of the critiques that I've heard the most of. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we were with you so far in the presentation. Yes, this is awesome. But what do you mean by abolition of prisons? Surely you don't mean like closing them all down and, all the things. So to crystallize the critique, I think it has 4 prongs. One is it's not prescriptive. It doesn't offer any specific alternatives. Second thing is it represents really a utopian vision of the world and of human nature. It's unrealistic for the current state of affairs. Like, maybe we could do it in the future, but right now, surely we cannot do that. And the lastly is that it only works in smaller countries, and usually somebody says, like one of my students says Sweden. That's usually or some Nordic country usually is the example of that. Well, in relation to the culture and history of people with disabilities, abolition of carceral enclosures is not a utopian dream for the future, but it actually happened, and it happened in the US and it happened in Canada in the form of deinstitutionalization in the field of mental health and intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the subsequent massive closure of residential institutions and psychiatric hospitals. So we had and have a really good example in the North American context of abolition of carceral facilities on a massive, massive scale. And I think that not knowing that history and culture, is part of that absence, that kind of colonial kind of taken away of culture. So this is my definition of deinstitutionalization. It's the closure of psychiatric hospital and large state institution for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's the movement of people with psychiatric and intellectual developmental disabilities, actually moving people from state institutions and hospitals into community living. And those are kind of 2 different things, but they're related. And then the third thing, which is what kind of my research brings into it, is that to me this is also a social movement, it's a logic, it's a mindset, it's an ideological shift in how we treat difference. So when we talk about carceral logic, to me the institutionalization is a decarceral logic. And in some instances also an abolition logic. So how did it work in terms of the US for those who are not familiar? And there's only one slide here with numbers, so apologies for people who dislike. Okay, so in 1955, the state mental health population in the US was over 500,000 people, meaning incarcerated inside hospitals. By 2000, it had fallen to below 100,000. In large residential institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we had almost 200,000 people in 1968, and then it dropped to less than 34,000 people. By 2014, 14 states in the US have closed all their large public institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So 14 states in the US do not have any what we call large, meaning over 16 people, type of institutions. So this kind of idea that we can't do it, and so on, is actually inaccurate. But, and this is really important, if we think of incarceration, like I suggested earlier, the incarceration doesn't just happen in one locale, it happens in various locales. I'm sorry, this is a graph, but it's the only graph. I will explain the graph. This is not my graph, this is Bernard Harcourt, actually his student, but made the graph. So there's 3 lines on the graph. One of the lines that has like the smallest dots is the rate of imprisonment, meaning incarceration in prisons. The dots that are a little bit wider is basically the institutionalization. It's incarceration per capita for, he only looked at psychiatric hospitals. So not institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, but just psych hospitals. So, and that rate has kind of fallen over the years. And the top graph, the top line, is the rate if you combine them together. So when we talk about the rise in incarceration, when people say, oh, there's been like massive rise in incarceration, you can see that per capita, actually, the most massive time in incarceration happened in the 50s, when there were people in the 60s, and then when there were people in institutions, inside hospitals, and in prisons at the same time, per capita. The other thing that's really interesting about this graph is that you see like a drop that's related to both the rate of imprisonment, and this happened in the 70s, and the rate of incarceration in psych facilities, and then there's a huge upsurge. And the upsurge is related to the rise of imprisonment in prisons. Does that make sense? So while one kind of fell, the other one peaked. So this last part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about how that works in relation to disability. So again, the connection between prisons and disability. The picture is a report called the Treatment Industrial Complex. It's free online in PDF. It's really, really interesting and important report that the grassroots leadership that's based in Texas did with the American Friends Service Committee. And in that report, they released it in 2015. In that report, they showed the shift on the part of incarceration industry into areas related particularly to mental health. One example, the report cites the GEO Group. Do people know what the GEO Group is? It's the largest private prison company in the US. I'm sure they have something going on in Canada. I did not research that, but I'm sure that's true. But they've become kind of like a trendsetter in this pivot towards marketing of so-called alternatives to incarceration. So in 2012, the GEO Group created a subsidiary group that they called GEO Care. I don't make this stuff up. GEO Care, which provides mental health services in prison in addition to operating state psychiatric hospitals with forensic units. Of course, the irony of a for-profit company providing mental health services to counter the disabling effects of its own prisons should not be lost here, right? The report also mentions a nursing home in Connecticut that specifically is used for aging and disabled state prisoners. So my point here is that we really need to think about expanding what James Kilgore called carceral humanism, and how it's compounded with carceral feminism and carceral, what I'm calling carceral ableism and carceral Sanism, in expanding the net of the carceral state. So I was recently in a gathering of people who fight against new jails. So people who do these campaigns like No New Jails, maybe you've seen them. And every one of us who's involved in these campaigns talked about how they're using particularly either drug addiction or mental health to open these new jails, every one of us, and this was in the US. And it's quite striking to me, actually, how carceral Sanism is become like the major engine of carceral expansion in the US currently, and how dangerous that is, and dangerous for various reasons, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the way that this comes to be is the call for the creation of more hospital beds in prisons, the reform of psychiatric hospitals, the creation of more accessible or mental health responsive prisons. So these are the kind of ways in which I think the carceral state has been expanding now. And again, this also comes from the work of James Kilgore, who really called it carceral humanism. How do we make carcerality more humane and then able to expand the net of incarceration? So we need to center the experiences of disablement and ableism in criminal, racial, and social justice movements. because of the trauma and disabling effects of detention and incarceration, which we hardly ever talk about. But also we need to talk about alternatives to incarceration, and especially here I talk about it through the framework of not in our name, meaning, when I give similar presentations to a different audience, which is audiences of disability rights, disability justice, MAD, neurodiversity movements, and so on, it's really important for me to kind of mobilize people to understand that our people are in prisons, and that this movement of carceral Sanism, it's something that's done, quote unquote, in our name. It's in the name of treatment. It's in the name that will benefit, our people, and how important it is to mobilize against it and for abolition for those reasons. So in regards to what I mean by also regarding alternatives to incarceration, I already mentioned the GO group, but beyond that, it's really important when we say, oh, people with various mental differences, various disabilities, especially psychiatric, versus various substance users, they need medical help and treatment, they don't need incarceration. Well, this kind of alternative to incarceration that people often espouse is incredibly dangerous too, because that usually leads to biopsychiatric interventions. It almost never leads to, oh, we need more peer support, we need more care that's done, in the family or in community. We need more support to create, stronger MAD movements. It almost always leads to biopsychiatry. So the kind of alternatives to incarcerations that are often espoused by abolitionists who don't have a cultural competency in disability and madness often leads us to these kind of pathways. So I want to suggest that we need to fight not only against carceral expansion via prisons and jails, which I just talked about, but also so-called treatment. And not just treatment behind bars, but the concept of treatment. What does it mean to treat, to correct, to rehabilitate? Biopsychiatry is often the only form of so-called treatment, and this is what Eric Fabrice calls chemical incarceration. And he really, in his work, he doesn't talk about it metaphorically. It's really interesting the way that he talks about chemical incarceration. And the way that these are often now discussed as alternatives to incarceration. I want to really caution us that these are not alternatives, they're just other forms of incarceration. I want to end with the lessons. Okay. No, there's no lessons, no. You got it. This is for discussion, no. I want to end my talk today with some lessons from deinstitutionalization. Because I think the lessons from deinstitutionalization are exactly that. Like, okay, so if we want to avoid the kind of pitfalls that I was just mentioning, what are some things that we can learn to really aid us towards the move to abolition of carceral spaces? Because it is something that already has happened, it is happening. So in regards to who can be decarcerated or who can, quote unquote, live on the outside, that has been a huge lesson, at least that I learned from deinstitutionalization, which is that often when decarceration happened, especially in institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, they started with, quote unquote, the most severe cases. Meaning that if we learned how to treat people in the community, and again, there is the use of the word treat, or sometimes they use the words handle, or whatever the case may be. But the point is, how do we kind of support people in the community that are, quote unquote, have the most kind of severe cases? Then we can support anybody to live in the community. So that has been really an interesting lesson, and that has been happening in terms of prison abolition as well. Like, there's a lot of people who do work with people who are, quote unquote, sex offenders, for example, the work of Erica Miners and the late Hani Knopp, who wrote the first manual called Instead of Prisons in '76. She did a lot of work with kind of quote unquote sexual offenders. So it's really important to kind of, instead of going the route of like innocence and let's start with the mild and let's start, to really start with the people that need the most support. And if we can do that, then surely we can do, legalize marijuana or something. So not necessarily we should start from that, but we should do all the things at the same time. The where and the what. So one of the really important lessons from deinstitutionalization is that institution and deinstitutionalization are not a place, but they are a logic. They're an anti-carceral logic. So it's not so much of where do we put people, as much as I am the people, what do I want? And kind of really changing society in a way that institutionalization would make no sense. And I think that that's the logic of abolition as well. Also, there needs to be a move to justice and community reinvestment, which is what did not happen during the institutionalization. So the money that was supposed to go to a variety of kind of community alternatives in the US never materialized itself there. So there was kind of a project of deinstitutionalization without actually putting kind of monetary state. And again, I'm not saying that that's the way to go, is to ask the state for that, but that there was a promise for that to happen, and it never materialized in the US context. And lastly, in terms of how to decarcerate, in the book, I'm not going to talk about it here because I'm also out of time, but in the book I talk a lot about the role of exposés and the role of lawsuits in bringing about the deinstitutionalization and how, really focusing on the conditions of confinement, how horrible they are, how disabling they are, and so on, which I've done myself. This was like my second slide today. That's not helpful. This kind of like shock and awe campaign actually ended up in reforming institutions instead of closing them down. And what ended up closing them down was not so much, let's focus on this shock and awe and disabling, but instead, a realization that people should not be segregated in the first place. So it was really a shift in logic and perspective that brought that, and I'm happy to talk about it more. In my work, I've called this process disepistemology, and I just want to kind of end with that, what that means. This is, something that I published, so for people who are interested, this came out in an article in Critical Criminology last year. But just to give an overview of what that means, when I say disepistemology, meaning not just knowing certain things, but letting go of certain things. So to me, the abolition of carcerality is an ethic, and it's an epistemology. It produces a specific form and not just contents of knowledge. And what do I mean by form of knowledge? I mean letting go of attachment to certainty, meaning what are the consequences of doing and not doing. Again, these are things that I learned from deinstitutionalization, that if we wait until there is this kind of idea of, okay, what are all the consequences, it will never happen. And this is not how deinstitutionalization went down. It was super, super messy, and nobody knew what to do. And this is how abolitionists, this is what we do every day. Like, we're facing really, really huge dilemmas, and we don't know how it's going to end up, but we know that what there is really screwed up, and we can't keep what is. And it's really, it's a process of trial and error. We need to let go of the idea that anyone can have a definitive pathway for how to rid ourselves of carceral logic. There is no kind of expert. So letting go also of expertise, like tell us what should be done, which is something I always get myself. Tell us, and it's absurd. Like, nobody can tell somebody how to decarcerate or deinstitutionalize. It's a collective project that has to happen. To let go of specific demands for futurity, particularly clairvoyance, meaning what would happen if, right? Or this idea of it gets better. Surely if we do this, then this will happen, and things of that nature. So to me, that's not how deinstitutionalization happened. The goal of abolition, therefore, is not finality, but process. It's a movement. This comes from Thomas Mathiesen, who's a abolitionist in Sweden, actually. Well, he's Norwegian, but he's done, abolition what? Yes. He's done a lot of work both in Norway and in Sweden. And he says that the alternative lies in the unfinished, in the sketch, in what is not yet fully existing. So this work of the unfinished, to me, is the work of abolition. And to me, it's a work that is about movement. It's about social movement, but it's also literally about keep moving. It's a fluid kind of thing, and it's a thing about trial and error. And this is a quote from Beth Ritchie, who has a chapter in the book Arrested Justice, which is about the feminist movement to end domestic violence, and how that movement has been really racist and not very feminist. So she has a chapter there that says how we won the mainstream but lost the movement. And to me, losing the movement is really anti-abolition. Losing the movement towards. And it's always kind of a process that's unfinished. So to end, I want to suggest that disability of color critique of incarceration and decarceration is not just about those who identify as disabled or disabled people of color who are caught up in the system. We really need to understand disability of color critique, much like feminist abolition, as an analytic and as a push or demand, a demand for justice that's very different, perhaps, than other demands for justice. It's about understanding policing, incarceration, and its alternatives as disability issues with everything that entails, from theorizing the disposability of certain populations and their susceptibility to premature death, which is Ruth Gilmore's definition of racism, to understanding the nature of systems of capture and exclusion, to building a new world that reacts very differently to harm and difference. Yes.
I guess it's just more of a comment on the production of labels in order to access resources. I'm an occupational therapy student, and I'm currently working in a chronic pain clinic right now, and just as someone who's trying to help people access resources, it's just been really just the labels that are required to access those resources. So especially with chronic pain, we have a lot of people with like myofascial back pain, which basically just means your back hurts all the time. But that often isn't enough to get onto something like AISH, which I can't remember what that stands for, but
Assured income for in Alberta is the assured income for the severely handicapped.
Right. I knew it was a terrible name, yeah. But often people would like to get onto AISH because it's a lot, there's more income on that than there is with Alberta Works. They also take into account prescription drugs, I believe, and things like that, which can get quite expensive for a lot of folks. I'm just thinking of one case in particular where her physical symptoms were not enough to, get this elusive diagnosis to be that's, appropriate enough for AISH. So she was referred to a psychiatrist, and it was like, well, maybe we can get you a diagnosis on that side to get approved for funding. So it is really interesting to see how these labels are constructed.
I actually want to, I don't think this is like directly related, but maybe. It's related to the notion of the fight to abolish segregation or solitary confinement, call it the different things. And I think that's also the issue with labeling and carceral logics, is because being in communities that do that kind of work of abolition, they often do it through the lens of we have to abolish it for people with mental health and intellectual disability. This is exactly how the death penalty works, like in the U.S. context, and this is because of Supreme Court case. But in relation to solitary confinement, this idea that people with psychiatric disabilities really cannot be in, and should not ever be in, places that will make their disabilities worse and, suicidal, and, we have had like a lot of these cases. And it's a really, this is the abolitionist dilemma, right? It's like to be in community with people who do that work. A lot of them identify as mad or psychiatrically disabled. And to also try to kind of push them to say, well, once we abolish it for people with mental health, aren't you then saying by doing this work that other people belong there, right? So to kind of like push it like a little bit further and then it becomes this kind of almost a question of strategy, like, well, and in the prison abolition, they call it the attrition model, right? Like, let's do it first for the young, first for women, first for like people with intellectual disabilities, and then, we can do the rest. But historically, that has not been a fruitful, in my opinion, approach. So, that's, I think, does, for me, reproduce carceral logic.